Hi everyone, for this chapter we will go through the process of photosynthesis. Last chapter we have gone over how we are able to break down molecules of glucose using cellular respiration. So, this chapter we will discuss how glucose are made in plants. Remember how I talked about humans can't make glucose from carbon dioxide and water, only plants can. And they do this by capturing energy from sunlight, which is what we discussed earlier, sunlight, which takes place within the plant cell organelles called chloroplasts. If you remember, we discussed this before. Remember that this is an endergonic process going where we have carbon dioxide and water as our reactant, and our glucose and oxygen is our products. Don't forget oxygen. Okay, that's the other product of this endergonic process. Okay, so for this chapter, we will be focusing on this glucose synthesis reaction. If you haven't already downloaded the worksheet for this chapter, let's pause the video and take out the worksheet for photosynthesis so we can follow along with the lecture video to complete your worksheet. So for item number 1, Item number 1A, we have our chemical reaction of synthesis of glucose right here, which is being oxidized and which is being reduced, though, is the question. Last chapter, I talked about how oxidation is when a molecule loses hydrogens, while reduction is when a molecule gains hydrogen. One is losing, one is gaining. If it's losing hydrogen, it's an oxidation reaction. If it gains a hydrogen, it is a reduction reaction. So here, carbon dioxide right here has a gain or lost oxygen to become glucose. It has gained hydrogen to make glucose, and hence this is a reduction reaction. Okay, so from carbon dioxide to glucose is a reduction reaction. And then you have your water. For water, it has lost hydrogens to make oxygen. Here's water, and it has lost water to make oxygen. So this is an oxidation reaction. Okay, oxidation reaction, and then reduction for carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide has been reduced to glucose, whereas water has been oxidized to oxygen. So this is the answer for your number 1A. Now for number 1B on your worksheet, the input of energy, as we have mentioned, comes from the sunlight. All right, the bonds that are formed from glucose synthesis reaction are actually very stable and long-lasting. For example, the fact that we can have coal as a source of energy is because they are made from sunlight energy that has been captured and stored by photosynthesis 200 to 350 million years ago. So these covalent bonds that are formed can provide us with energy for years and years. So here's coal right here that we use to run our factories and things like that. Those bonds that we use to break for energy are made long time ago. And hence that's how we have fuel. All right. So while we are on the topic of photosynthesis, we can divide organisms into those that can generate their own food and those that can't. In the energy chapter, we have introduced excuse me. We have introduced the idea of producers versus consumers. Now we are going to classify organisms by their ability to make food. For those that can make their own food through sunlight, we call them photoautotrophs, which translate to self-feeders, which means they can feed on their own. They don't need to rely on other species or ingesting other species as a source of energy. So examples of these are like those aloe leaf plants we have looked at in lab, cyanobacteria, Remember that? We looked at all oxalatoria and gliocapsa, and they had these green stuff inside. Those are what we've seen in lab that can do photosynthesis because they are photoautotrophs. And they have all the time, if they are photoautotroph, usually they will appear green on the when you look at them, because they must have some sort of photosynthetic pigment in order to do photosynthesis. And a lot of those photosynthetic pigments are green. All right, so for those that must rely on consuming sugars produced by photosynthetic organisms for energy, they are called heterotrophs, which translate to other feeders, and they must rely on consuming other species in order to get energy. Examples are, of course, animals and humans ourselves, fungi, and most other bacteria. Remember that only bacteria that can do photosynthesis are cyanobacteria, as they appear green because they have those photosynthetic pigment like chlorophyll. The last type of feeders are also cell feeders, but they don't use sunlight as an energy source to make food. They use chemicals to make food, and hence they are called chemoautotrophs. That's why they're called chemoautotrophs, because they use chemicals in the beginning of that prefix right there tells you what they use for food. They can make sugars by extracting energy from inorganic chemical compounds, so that is why they are called chemoautotrophs. An example of these are your thermophilic bacteria from the very bottom of the ocean that lives in those deep sea vents like these right here. So these are deep sea vents around this area, and usually they have what looks like smoke coming out of it. But within those area, you'll be able to isolate bacteria that looks like these, and they are able to live and thrive in that area, even though they cannot see sunlight because they're all the way down in that deep bottom of the ocean. There's no way there's sunlight there. So they are making energy with chemicals instead. And they're called thermophilic bacteria. Okay, so the basic process of photosynthesis is when we turn specific wavelengths of sunlight, which is the visible spectrum that I will talk about in a bit, along with starting materials, carbon dioxide and water, as we have mentioned many times, and turn them into oxygen and an intermediate molecule that we have talked about from cellular respiration chapter called glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. This is an intermediate that we have broken our glucose into during glycolysis and cellular respiration. So for photosynthesis, in order to turn your intermediate back to a glucose molecule, you got to make those intermediate. And one of those key intermediates you have to make in order to generate glucose is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. Other plants can generate other simple carbohydrate molecules as well. Some plants will then turn your glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate into glucose molecules. Some will turn them into sucrose or other types of sugars that we have mentioned. It all depends on what type of plant it is and what type of fruit that it makes. So different plants can make different types of carbohydrates, as we have talked about in chapter 3, the different types of carbohydrates you can have. So if you have taken if you have to take 1407, which is the next general biology class, you will have to study a lot more detail into plant anatomy. But for 1406, we will just cover a few of its parts, bits and pieces of it, that participate in photosynthesis. That's why we have these basic photosynthetic structures in here for this chapter. We won't go into depth about anatomy or how plants are reproduced, but you will learn that in 1407. In the microscopic view of a leaf, for example, their cells are divided into different layers right here. And the middle layer is called mesophyll. This is a layer of cells that are actively doing photosynthesis. You will also see veins like this going through that middle layer to supply the cells with water. because in order to do photosynthesis, you have to have water. And since they don't have, blood vessels like us, they go by their roots. And from roots, they go up to their stems and then into those veins that will provide all these plant cells within the leaf for photosynthesis. If you look underneath a leaf, you will see that they have little openings that function like our mouth and our nose. And these are the examples of those openings. These openings are called stomata. Okay, stomata. And they are important for gas exchange. Just like our mouth or nose, oxygen and carbon dioxide goes in and out through here. So here's carbon dioxide going in and oxygen going out. And it's just that they are breathing in carbon dioxide and breathing out oxygen, which is opposite of what we do in humans. But just like how our mouth function for gas exchange, leaves have little mouths like this at the bottom of their leaf for regulating those gas. But it's just in opposite direction for them compared to us. So these again are called stomata. It also plays a role in water balance of plant cells. These stomata are located underneath a leaf because when sunlight hits the top surface of a leaf, water can escape through these openings and cause dehydration. So for plants, it is critical that these openings are located under the leaf to minimize that water loss. That's why you don't see little stomatas on the top of the leaf, because when sunlight comes and hits that top of the leaf, and if those mouths, little stomatas happen to be open, all the water is just going to escape out of the leaf because of the sunlight. But if it's underneath, is in the shade, it is less likely that those water will be lost through sunlight. Okay, so in addition, each of these stoma, or, the plural form is stomata, singular form is stoma, they have what's called guard cells that will regulate opening and closing by either swelling or shrinking in response to osmotic changes. For example, when plants are exposed to sunlight, it will stimulate guard cells to swell, which then opens the stomata and increase the rate of gas exchange to complete photosynthesis. On the other hand, when there is water shortage, guard cells will shrink, causing the stomata to close, and that will decrease the rate of water loss through those openings. So these are those guard cells within the stomata. Okay, for helping to regulate the opening and closing of these little mouths, if you think about it that way, underneath the leaves. A third component for cellular respiration is chloroplasts, which are mostly located in cells within the mesophyll layer, as we've talked about, because those are the cells that are actively doing photosynthesis. Remember from previous chapter that we talked about how chloroplasts in plant cells have stacks of circular structures called thylakoids. Okay, those circular green pancake looking thing is a thylakoid. And inside each thylakoid are light absorbing pigment called chlorophyll. Just like mitochondria, chloroplast also has two layers of membrane. As you can see, this is your outer membrane. This is your inner membrane, just like how mitochondria also had two layers. Now, for chloroplast, they need these two layers because they also need to utilize the electron transport chain, which are integral proteins that are within the inner membrane to create also hydrogen ion concentration gradient, as we will talk about in a bit. But all these protein complexes are just like your cellular respiration, but they're for a different purpose. In cellular respiration, the electron transport chain was to move electrons and for electron carriers to drop off their electrons, ultimately driving your ATP synthase to make ATP. This also happens in photosynthesis, but there are other parts to the electron transport chain, and they're not called complex 1 through 4. They're called something else. I'll now go over with you all those parts in a bit. Okay, so the stacks of thylakoid as a whole is called a granum. So this stack of thylakoid is called a granum. And while the surrounding medium within the chloroplast is called the stroma. So kind of like how we talked about mitochondrial membrane versus mitochondrial matrix, the cristae versus mitochondrial matrix. Here we have granum or thylakoids that's within the chloroplast for doing the photosynthesis, and then the medium or the fluid within the chloroplast is called the stroma. So make sure you don't mix up stroma from stoma. Okay, stomata is the mouth-like opening underneath the leaf, while stroma is the fluid within the chloroplast. Okay, they are just off by a letter or two, so make sure you don't mistake these two on the exam. Stroma versus stomata. Okay, all right. There are two parts to photosynthesis, just like cellular respiration. The first part is called the light-dependent reactions, which is when energy from the sun is absorbed by the photosynthetic pigment chlorophyll, and it is converted into stored chemical energy in forms of either ATP or your electron carriers. The electron carriers is a little different from those in the cellular respiration, and I'll come back to this idea, but you see this NADPH here. That's an electron carrier. Okay? And ATP is a source of energy. Both of these are critical to power the next part of photosynthesis. And hence that next part, or the second part of photosynthesis, is called the light-independent reaction, or better known as the Calvin cycle. Calvin cycle. Kind of like your Krebs cycle, but it's called the Calvin cycle for photosynthesis. This is where chemical energy from light-dependent reaction will be used to drive the assembly of sugar molecules from carbon dioxide. Okay, so this is where carbon dioxide will come into play, and that is why plants need to breathe in carbon dioxide in order to do photosynthesis, because they need carbon dioxide in order to run this Calvin cycle right here. Okay, they need carbon dioxide input into the Calvin cycle in order to produce that glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate intermediate we were just talking about to make glucose. So before we get into the heart of photosynthesis reactions, we need to define a couple of things first. First of all, when we talk about the sunlight that is used to power photosynthesis, it is actually just absorbing a specific portion of light called the visible spectrum or visible light. The sun actually emits a whole array of different wavelengths. We're all seen and listed in this figure right here. Okay, from very high frequency wavelength to very low frequency wavelength. This whole spectrum of light that the sun emits is called the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, which encompasses light that goes from very high frequency, like I was saying, which is something like the gamma rays, and light that goes very low frequency, which is something like radio waves. The light that we can actually see with our eyes is only this tiny portion of the electromagnetic radiation spectrum, which is the visible light. So this is that tiny portion we can see in the visible light spectrum. When we talk about sunlight, we define them by wavelengths and frequency because light travels in waves. And by eye, it looks like they're traveling in a straight line. But if you've taken physics before, if you will have to take physics, I don't know. But you learn that light actually travel in waves. The shorter the wavelengths are, the higher the frequency. Hence, it has more energy when compared with those that are longer wavelengths. The longer the wavelengths are, the lower the frequency, and hence it has less energy. You can see it through this animation here. Here's a wavelength that is longer wavelength, and it's moving as the animation is showing like this. So for any given amount of time, there are less wavelength that's going through this area right here when it's a longer wavelength. Maybe we can count 1, 2, 3, 4 wavelengths. Whereas when the wavelength is shorter, okay, so this is a shorter wavelength, okay, then you can see that there's a higher frequency, which means at a given time point, there's a lot more wavelength going through this area here compared to those that are longer wavelengths. So maybe by eye about 8 to 10 wavelength versus 4 wavelengths here. So this is why a shorter wavelength would give you higher energy, whereas longer wavelength will give you shorter energy. And in that sense, those that are of higher wavelength, light that is of higher frequency, not higher wavelength, higher frequency, shorter wavelength, can cause more damage to your tissues because they are going in your body at a much higher frequency and higher energy compared to the longer wavelength. So that's why radio waves is not as damaging to our tissues compared with gamma rays. And lucky thing, gamma rays usually is something that exists in space because a lot of our atmosphere of the Earth actually already filter out a lot of those gamma waves. So for example, other waves that we are exposed to though are UV rays. UV rays are those that are coming from the sun and it's not as filtered by the Earth atmosphere, and they can hit our skin and cause damage to our skins. And that's why they say if you go out in the sun too much with UV exposure, you can give you a higher risk of skin cancer, or those light boxes that you go in, those tanning box, okay, they are actually radiating UV rays as well. So the other thing we use often in medical field is X-ray. X-ray is also of higher frequency or shorter wavelength range, which means they are more higher energy, and hence they are so strong that they can actually penetrate into tissues and cause damage. But we use it because we can look inside the body and we can compensate. the benefit outweighs the risk. Okay, so it goes through your tissues, which that's why tissues don't appear on X-rays. Bones have a much higher density, and that's why bones appear on X-ray, because they won't absorb as much of that X-ray as your tissues. X-ray would just go straight through soft tissues, whereas when it hits the bone, it's of a higher density and it's harder to go through those. That's why X-ray, you can see your bones versus your tissues. All right, so for the human eye, or the plant's chloroplast in that case, they can only sense wavelengths within the visible spectrum from 400 nanometers to 700 nanometers. Red color wavelengths are shorter, as you can see here. Red color wavelengths are longer, as you can see here, longer wavelength, whereas your violet is shorter wavelength. Okay, so hence red color wavelengths have less energy, whereas violet color wavelengths have higher energy. So less energy for red, higher energy for violet. So that's why red tends to be in the 700 nanometer range, as you can see here, whereas violet, you're talking about more closer to your 400 nanometer range. Okay. So that's why we introduced these wavelengths when we were talking about the spectrophotometer in your enzyme lab, if you remember. Now, there are specific pigments in plant cells that can absorb specific wavelengths within visible light. What wavelength these pigments can absorb can be seen in an absorption spectrum right here, as you have looked at when you were working on the spectrophotometer lab. We have explored this already, and we were looking at maximum absorption wavelength for tetraglycol. You remember, when the enzyme is added to glycol, it changes the color of the solution from clear, colorless, to more of a brownish color, and we used a spectrophotometer to figure out what was the maximum absorption wavelength for that brown color. Now, there are two main classes of photosynthetic pigments. One is called your chlorophyll, and the other is called the carotenoids. So these carotenoids, as in like, kind of sounds like carrots, okay? So that's why when you see them, the color of these different pigments in lab exercise this week, you will see them in different colors, whereas chlorophyll, you see them more as green color, whereas carotenoids are more in that yellowish color. Okay, so chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B, okay, have maximum absorbance in the blue spectrum, okay, and the red visible light spectrum. Okay, while beta carotene has a maximum absorbance in just the blue. So beta carotene are the dot right here, this line right here, and it's only one maximum absorption peak within closer to the blue area. Whereas both chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B has two peaks, at one at closer to red and one that's closer in the blue. Okay. All right, now we are ready to talk about the steps of the two parts of photosynthesis. Now, light-dependent reactions will convert sunlight or solar energy into chemical energy. Remember, we talked about transformation of energy from one form to another in Chapter 6. And those chemical energy will be stored in forms of ATP and NADPH. ATP, we already talked about immensely as a currency for energy. NADPH is a form of electron carrier for photosynthesis. Notice that the electron carrier for photosynthesis is very close in spelling to that in cellular respiration. So make sure you don't confuse the two on lecture exams. The electron carriers for cellular respiration is NADH and FADH2. While photosynthesis, you have an extra P within the electron carrier name. So just remember it as P for photosynthesis. So it is NADPH as electron carriers for photosynthesis. All right, so let's take a break here and I will continue in the part 2 of chapter 8. Be sure to get your worksheet ready and we'll be coming back to the worksheet right in a bit.